Welcome to City Church. We are a biblically based, relationally driven, spirit-led church, encouraging everyone to follow Jesus, grow together, and serve others. We're excited to share this sermon with you today, and you can always find out more about us online at citychurchcville.com.
What we're going to be dealing with this morning in the sermon series, it's 3 weeks long, is just very simply looking at Sabbath. We're going to look at Jesus and Sabbath this morning. Would you stand with me? What we do at City every week is we pray the Lord's Prayer together out loud before the message. So here's what the text teaches us. This then is how you should pray. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done.
On earth in Charlottesville as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Amen. Turn, give your neighbor a fist bump, high five, hug, handshake. Take a moment to greet one another. So, hey, again, what we're going to be looking at today is the idea of a Sabbath rest. A Sabbath rest. Last time I preached, we began the journey towards Sabbath, and we began by looking in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, just a brief recap, so we're all in a level playing field before we take a look at what we're going to take a look at this morning. Genesis 2, 1 through 3, thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested, which in Hebrew is the word for Sabbath. He Sabbatheth from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he what? He rested from all the work of creating that he had done. And then what we discover in the Older Testament, the next book, the second book of the Older Testament, we discover in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, God brings the law to Moses, the Ten Commandments, and he introduces himself before he gives the law the following way. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. And as I mentioned the last time I preached, you can read the Ten Commandments the following way. Here we go. God set Israel free politically and militarily. But if you want to stay free as a person in the depths of your soul, there are 10 things you want to keep in mind. The fourth law that God brings, the fourth thing to keep in mind is this. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath. And remember this at all times, the word Sabbath means to stop, to cease. So the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But on the seventh day, what did he do? He rested. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now, here's where I want us to begin. Let's talk about rest. And how I want to do this, beginning to do this, I want you to think about how you get ready to go to sleep. I want you to think just for a moment. What do you do when you get ready to rest? What do you do? My wife is really into rest. Here's some things that I've learned from my beautiful wife. You're not supposed to eat after a certain hour. Is that true? Okay. You're not supposed to look at a digital screen for less than 30 minutes before you go to rest. Don't look at a digital screen. Next thing is you're supposed to go to sleep at the same time every day. Your body gets into a rhythm, so I've been told. And you're supposed to wake up at the same time every day. In other words, sleeping in, really you don't get more rest. Here's another thing that I've learned. The room has to be dark. Studies have been done, supposedly, according to my wife. The darker it is, the better you sleep. The latest one that I've learned is the temperature needs to be very cool. Studies have been done. The next thing is, do you shower before you go to bed? Some do, some don't. One of my 3 kids has a weighted blanket. It's full of glass beads. And if you put it over yourself, it feels like a sumo wrestler is hugging you all night long. One of my kids loves that. I've got some friends here at City. We were talking about this in the past, and they have an overhead fan that goes all night, and it cools them off and provides white noise. Fran has also told me it has to be totally quiet in order to sleep well. Other things I've learned is you can buy a mattress that is the price of a used car, and they guarantee you will rest very, very well. And then you're supposed to ask yourself the question, I don't know how you would know this, but are you a side sleeper? Stomach sleeper? Back sleeper? How many of you snore? Ask your spouse. They'll be honest with you. Here's another thing I learned about rest or sleeping is when you get married, not everyone rests the same as you do. My bedroom is now dark, cold. Here's the latest thing for sleep in our marriage. See this pillow? This is a contoured pillow that I bought off of Amazon. And I like this pillow. This pillow, as important as it is to me, is no longer mine. It belongs to my wife, Fran. Because the reason for it is her neck no longer hurts when she uses my pillow. So I use this flat, listless, lifeless pillow now in which I sleep on. Think again about how you get ready to rest. You prepare for it, don't you? But here's an interesting thought. Could it be that your physical body is rested, but the soul is restless, in a state of unrest? You see, when we start talking about Sabbath, what we're going to talk about is Jesus talks about the soul. The soul. And so normally in every sermon that's preached at City, we have what's called Feet to Your Faith, and that happens at the end of the message. But Feet to Your Faith is going to be right at the beginning. You're going to see why. Because of the very brief look at Jesus and the Sabbath that we're going to take a look at now. I know some of us here at City have been anxious to get to the mechanics of Sabbath. What does Sabbath look like? We're going to deal with that next week. I'm going to have a lot of resources. We're going to talk about the mechanics of Sabbath. But the reason why we're doing this week and looking at Jesus first is because you could get the mechanics right and your soul will not be rested because of what we're getting ready to learn now. So here's the brief passage we're going to take a look at. Jesus and rest. Matthew 11, 28-30. Here's what Jesus says. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. Does that describe you? Studies have shown that in our culture, there has been a crescendo of weariness in our culture. And Jesus stands in front of us and says, come to me, all you who are weary and what? Burdened. And I, he says, will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart. In other words, you show up weary and burdened, and you meet someone who is gentle and humble in heart. And Jesus goes on to say, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Jesus begins by saying this, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened. All you who are weary and burdened. The Greek word for weary simply means this, toil that is exhausting. It can also mean that there's work, but there's a lack of return. The ROI isn't good. It could also speak to a lack of a sense of purpose. And then burdened is what is done to you. Someone or something burdens you. You toil, you work. So the idea is Jesus is saying that wherever you find yourself, if it's because of what you're doing, that you need rest. Or because of what someone's done to you or something that's put upon you that maybe you would have never signed up for, but here it is. Or you've got both. Jesus says, come to me, and I will give you rest. Where do you go when you're wearied and burdened? When you're exhausted? When you sense a lack of return for your efforts? Maybe you sense a lack of purpose. Where do you go when stuff's put upon you that you wouldn't sign up for? You're weary and burdened. Where do you go? What do you do? Do you binge Netflix? Do you watch hours and hours of a show? How many of you would confess before God and man every once in a while you've done that? Maybe it's a substance you turn to. Something that you know isn't good for you, but it gives you brief relief. Maybe you just turn within yourself. Another one that some people do is when they're weary and burdened, they develop expectations of people that are close to them that those people could never fulfill. Wearied and burdened. Jesus comes to us when we begin to talk about rest and Sabbath, and he says, come to me. And he says, I'll give it to you. You don't earn it. You come to Jesus, and he gives it. That's incredible news. Jesus at the beginning says, I will give you rest. And near the end of the passages we just read, he guarantees you this, you will find rest for your souls. If you come to me, he says, you will find rest for your souls. It's interesting to note that the Greek word there for find actually means to learn, to discover, and especially after searching. What it tells us is that when we approach Jesus and we're looking for the rest that we need because we're weary and we're burdened, he says, find me. Learn, discover, search. And then he says, if you'll do that, you will find rest. The Greek word for here for rest is the word that means recreation or recreation. Intermission, the stopping of any motion or business or labor. And then he says, you will find rest for your what? For your soul. The word in Greek here for soul literally means to breathe or to blow. It's from the Hebrew understanding of the Hebrew word soul, which is nephesh. It means throat. It's literally what it means. It means life. If you say the Hebrew word nephesh, you can hear the breath. You hear it like the breathing out. And the Jews believe, and the biblical people believe that nephesh, that's where all life kind of goes in and out of. And so soul has that understanding of where breath goes in and out of, life goes in and out of, food goes in and sustains you. And Jesus says, you will find rest for your soul. It's interesting to note that the Greek word for soul is the one that we get psychology from. It's where we battle in our hearts. It's also the understanding of a person's distinct identity. I wouldn't ask for a show of hands, but how many of us are weary? We are burdened. Jesus says, listen, I want you to come to me. I want you to come to me, and if you do, you will find. It's something that you dig into. And when you do, you will find rest for your soul. I'll give it to you. Now, in the middle of these two promises where Jesus says, if you come to me, you're going to find rest. If you come to me, I'll give you rest. There's sort of this sandwich, and in the middle of that sandwich, here's what Jesus says, and it's important for us to understand what he means. In the middle of this brief excerpt from the Gospel of Matthew, the two verses in the middle say this: take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find, here it is, rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. 2 times in that passage, you see the word yoke. Most of us think of a yoke that'll carry buckets of water, or 2 oxen that, what is it called when they're hooked together? What is it again? They are yoked. We think of that, but that's an inaccurate reading. You see, a yoke and a burden is the teaching of a rabbi. It's called their yoke. And their yoke will put some type of a burden on you. So Jesus' teachings are called his yoke. And notice what he says. He says, my yoke is easy. My burden is light. And it's interesting to note that Jesus rebukes the Pharisees and the teachers of the law because of their burden. I want to read it for you. Later on in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus warns against hypocrisy. Here's what he says. Then Jesus said to the crowds and his disciples, and the teachers of the law and the Pharisees are right there. They're literally right there. And Jesus looks at that huge crowd, and here's what he says. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. By the way, Moses' seat is a literal seat in the synagogue where the teacher comes and sits. It's kind of the privileged spot. Jesus says they come in, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they sit in that privileged seat. And then here's how he describes their yoke and burden. He says they tie up heavy, cumbersome loads. That's that same Greek word for burden. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. Remember, we talked about being weary and burdened. It's something that's done to you. But they themselves are not willing to lift their pinky finger to move the burden. Isn't it interesting? Jesus describes some of the teachers of the law, some of the Pharisees, as their yoke is so burdensome that you show up weary and burdened, and when you leave, it's worse than when you came in. Can you imagine showing up and you're weary and you're burdened and you want God to lift your burden, and when you show up, the person stands up from the Moses seat, and when they're done, your tires are totally flat. Jesus says that's their teaching. But going back to himself, he says, I want you to hear me. He says, my burden, my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Now, why would he say that? Oh, it's a huge call to commitment. Don't kid yourself. But Jesus is willing not just only to lift a finger, but he lifts everything he is in order for us to have our burdens removed from us. So the question becomes, where do you go? When you are weary and burdened, you come to Jesus. Because here's what I can tell you. Next week, we're going to look at the mechanics of Sabbath. In the mechanics of Sabbath, your body will be rested. You're going to learn what it looks like to put down work and to trust God. But if you don't come to Jesus as a Jesus follower, you will miss the restoration of your soul. Your physical body might be rested, but the soul could easily exit that time being weary and burdened. It's interesting to note that immediately following this little paragraph, there are two stories of Jesus and Sabbath. You see, Jesus didn't come to get rid of Sabbath, but he gives this teaching first about what rest looks like, and then the immediate following two stories are two episodes from Jesus on a Sabbath. You see, these are connected, but you can't miss the first part and only get the Sabbath. So again, next week, I'll come with suggestions and resources and personal thoughts about Sabbath. But the reality of it is, we cannot miss Jesus. And oftentimes when we talk like this, we think of St. Augustine, where he said about God, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. I'm going to ask that you would stand with me. And as we stand together, I'd like for you, if you're comfortable doing this, just close your eyes for a moment. As we stand into God's presence and we close our eyes, would you by faith take a moment to hear Jesus saying to you, "All you who are weary and burdened," you're weary. Your toil has left you worn out. The return for your work, or maybe you struggle with a lack of purpose. Or you're burdened. Something has been placed upon you that you would never sign up for. Jesus is here with his Spirit this morning. And if you are weary and you are burdened, with your eyes closed but your heart open, if you are weary and burdened, I would encourage you just to kind of, with your eyes closed, heart open, just kind of lift your hands up in front of you as a sign of your receptivity to Jesus and your humility. And I want you to hear the promise said to you, not to everyone else in the world, not to the person to your left or to your right, but hear it for yourself. Jesus would say, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." As we're in this prayerful moment, I just encourage you to invite Jesus into the depths of your soul. That you would surrender those other things that you turn to find your rest, and you would look to him.